Welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you with the help of our friends at Bauer Group Asia, and we will tell you more about them as it comes up. I am Ray Powell. I am in California, the part of it that is not on fire, thankfully. And he is Jim Carouso. He is down in Arizona. Jim, how are you?
All good here. Glad to see another Aussie on our program today.
Yeah, that's right. We're going back to our Australian roots, such as they are. He is another repeat guest. He appeared on our most popular audio podcast to date, which was Audio 7, which he shared with Mike Studeman. That was Why Should We Care About the Defense of Taiwan. He is Australian Army Major General Mick Ryan. He is the author of 3 books. He is writing about one a year, which starts to make us wonder what is if the AI and the drones are writing them for him and he just comes in and signs it at the end. War Transformed, the future of 21st century great power competition and conflict. White Sun War, a fictional account of the campaign for Taiwan. And The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire, just published last August, I believe. So we were interested in talking to him because he's been writing quite a bit about the impact that unmanned or uncrewed or autonomous vehicles, also known as drones, have been having on the modern battlefield, especially in Ukraine. And he's argued that adapting to this new reality is urgent to gaining a competitive edge in this new way of war. So, Mick Ryan, if now is the age of drone warfare in Eastern Europe, why should Indo-Pacific nations care?
Well, g'day, Ray. G'day, Jim. It's great to see you both again, and it's always a real pleasure to speak with you both, whether it's virtual or in person. And I would like to state for the record, the reason why episode 7 is so popular is probably more due to Mike Studeman than to me. He's just amazing. But no, thanks for the invitation to come back. So why do drones matter? I think there's a bunch of reasons, and there's lots of experts and lots of not so experts out there talking about this. For me, a lot of the focus isn't so much the battlefield impacts, even though they're going to be important in the air, on the sea, under the sea, and on the ground. It's the institutional impacts that I really focus on, because I think the teaming of humans with machines and the teaming of humans with algorithms is something that will have very deep cultural, organizational, and doctrinal impacts that many institutions are either struggling with or just had not yet fully appreciated. Because, uncrewed systems and algorithms allow for more rapid action, different kinds of risk calculus in taking action, as well as the potential for more rapid decision-making. Whether it's better decision-making, I still think is an open question, and I think Israel's Gaza operations shows us the impact of magnifying the number of targets that are produced by AI, but I'm not sure it always means it's higher quality decision-making or the right strategic decision-making. So, drones and AI are important. We need to think about them carefully. And I think we need to ensure we don't make the same mistakes we made by jumping into social media without thinking about the societal impacts first.
So, Mick, one of your predecessors, John Monash, was the first one to integrate tanks with infantry and scored a stunning success. Is integrating drone into our warfare, is that the same level of revolution, or is it something different?
I think in many respects, it's the same. Monash integrated tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft in the Battle of Hamel. And I think there are many similar cultural issues with integrating drones as there were with this. I mean, you saw in the US and Britain and Russia and Germany profound cultural struggles within the institutions about the future role of tanks between World War I and World War II. And it wasn't until the Germans proved how they should be used that everyone kind of coalesced around that idea. We're seeing the same with drones. We've seen very significant arguments in institutions about the use of uncrewed systems over the last 25, 30 years, and it's only been with the demonstrated use in Ukraine that once again, Western institutions are starting to coalesce around what is the right way to use these things, in what scale, what quantities, and importantly, how quickly should we and can we adapt them
So, of course, there's our view on how quickly we should do this, and then we have adversaries who have a view, and they're going to go into it whether we approve or not. So, what is the danger of being too fast and getting it wrong versus being too slow and being overwhelmed? You talked about the Germans figuring out how to do tank warfare before anybody else was ready, and we had to catch up very quickly. Are we in danger of falling behind, or are we in danger of moving too fast?
Yeah, I mean, you've always got to be careful as a strategic leader about rushing to failure, over-investing in something too quickly, which the adversary, either suckers you into or you've been silly enough to sucker yourself into. I think one of the beauties of drones, which is different to tanks and ships and stealth aircraft, is many drones are very cheap. So you can get out there and experiment at a cost that's much, much lower than, say, even tank experimentation was in the 20s and 30s, even by people riding bicycles with fake tanks over the top. So it's actually cheaper to take riskier bets with many types of drones, not all of them, but with many of them, that hasn't been possible before. So I think we can take more risks. We can do lots of different kinds of experiments at a cost that is an order of magnitude lower than, say, the Zumwalt class cruisers or an F-22 or what comes after the M1 Abrams main battle tank.
So you've studied the Ukraine war thoroughly, carefully, thought about these new tactics. What are the lessons for countries like Australia, Japan, Taiwan that they should be taking from Ukraine?
Well, I think the first big lesson is that uncrewed systems matter and have a role in future force structures across all services. I mean, that's the macro lesson. But the follow-on from that is you need what I call translation filters for the lessons from Ukraine. We're probably not going to use them exactly how they do in every circumstance for a variety of geographic, terrain, cultural, resource and technological reasons. Neither the Japanese or the Taiwanese or the US military, but there will be many commonalities. But we need to say, well, what are the differences in context that we need to translate what we're seeing in Ukraine to, say, the Western Pacific, which really is, probably the highest risk military zone in the world at the moment for a future conflict. So I think they're two really important endeavours. We also need to think through what is going to be the balance of crewed and uncrewed systems. I see these predictions generally by the tech industry who know zero about the military or the phenomenon of war, who say, we won't need any fighters anymore, or we won't need tanks anymore. Ukraine proves this. Well, Ukraine hasn't proved anything of the sort. Ukraine has proved that large-scale wars reducing big casualties to humans and equipment, and that there is a role for both crewed and uncrewed systems, cheap and exquisite systems, all in the same organisation, which has actually always been the case, because that's what gives us flexibility and our adaptive capacity when we're surprised. The big decisions about what is the right balance of crewed and uncrewed, cheap and exquisite in a modern warfighting organisation. And they're the kind of things that we need to be doing experimentation, concept development, and people development on into the future.
So one person who agrees with your ratcheting up the importance of this discussion is Admiral Sam Paparo at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, who recently in an interview with the Washington Post talked about turning the Taiwan Strait into a, quote, hellscape, and uncrewed systems were a large part of how to do that, how to defeat or to deter, better yet, a cross-strait invasion through the liberal use of AI and drones and those kinds of things. And the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense, last year launched a program called Replicator, which seeks to churn out huge numbers of drones. So the America seems to be moving quickly in that direction. Is it moving quickly enough?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad there's at least one person who agrees with me. I think one of the problems we have is when many write about these issues, they overgeneralize about the US military as if it's just one great single entity that just makes a decision. It's like, well, there's nothing of the sort. No military institution is. And, I think the Replicator program, largely overseen, I think, by Kath Hicks and Mike Horowitz, who are two not just great scholars, but good leaders and thinkers on this topic and many others, I think was an extraordinarily good program. I think they probably never had all the money they needed to do stuff, but conceptually, I think it was extraordinarily important to start forcing cultural change and force structure change more broadly across the military, down into the services, into the joint force. The COCOMs, I think, are a bit different. I think they've been actually ahead of the game in many respects. I think, once again, you can overgeneralize the US military, but you look at what Indo-Pacom's doing. I've been out there in the last years, talked to key staff there. I mean, they are hyper-focused on the Western Pacific, not just Taiwan, but a whole range of different contingencies. So things like hellscape, to me, make perfect sense. I think there is a very compelling logic to it. It isn't about replacing current con planes or O planes that Indo-Pacom might have, but complementing them, building additional ones, working more closely with the Taiwanese, which I think is a real imperative, because the Taiwanese, haven't been part of big, major multilateral exercises for many decades. So I think things like hellscape is just the leading edge of many initiatives when it comes to uncrewed systems, algorithmic support to decision-making, human-machine teaming, is a very good initiative. And it certainly should be, I think, changing the Chinese calculus. They really have to rethink how they've been doing some of their experimentation and planning around any potential blockade or invasion of Taiwan or Senkakus or any of the number of other contingencies they might be dreaming up.
So it seems right now we're sort of in an arms race with China and Russia on developing capabilities of drones, as well as capabilities of anti-drone warfare. One way we were going to all together work towards winning this race was AUKUS, the agreement between Australia, US, and UK, to cooperate not just in subs, but in technology development for warfighters. Have you seen any evidence that we are, A, winning the race, and B, that AUKUS is producing something towards this end?
Well, AUKUS Pillar 2, as you know, is those technological elements ostensibly to complement the AUKUS Pillar 1, but I think it's far broader than that and should be far broader than that. I mean, AUKUS overall is about creating a strategic deterrent, and I think strategic deterrence is more than just nuclear-powered attack submarines. So Pillar 2 is extraordinarily important in some of the technologies things. We're certainly running a race, whether we've won it or not. I don't think you could state that, but some of the trials we've seen with uncrewed systems, we saw a month-long activity between the AUKUS participants down in Jervis Bay last year that I think was extraordinarily useful. Demonstrate a range of different mission types and sets for uncrewed systems on and under the water. You're starting to see collaborative programs that have been around for a long time, but done in universities and not formalised or were funded by countries we prefer not to fund these things. So we're starting to see that. We're seeing the replacement of Chinese money with American, British and Australian government money, which I think is good. I think the problem with AUKUS at the moment is, I've been a fan right from the start of AUKUS Pillar 3, which is all the conceptual and warfighting and doctrinal and personnel transformations, not evolution, but transformations are going to be required to force us to think very, very differently about fighting and supporting deterrence and military operations in the 21st century. How do you bring all this new technology into a new construct that generates a strategic, operational and tactical set of advantages against the PLA? That's one thing I think we're behind. It's something that I think would be far cheaper than the other two pillars, but would magnify the impact of the other two pillars.
So besides the U.S. and its sort of highly developed allies, there are also a large number of developing countries out there who are trying to figure out how to live in this world of these great powers. As they say, the elephants moving around the circus and they're the grass that gets crushed And one of these countries, the Philippines, of course, also a U.S. ally, but a developing country, recently discovered what appears to be a Chinese autonomous underwater drone in its own archipelagic waters. So how should developing countries be looking at drones in this age? Are they primarily, should they be looking at them primarily as a threat, or should they start to be thinking of them as an opportunity to somehow level the playing field with these larger countries?
It's a bit of both, right? The Philippines have discovered at least one of these, and we don't know how many they've discovered they haven't declared. The Indonesians have discovered a couple. Inevitably, others will have it. It's almost certain that the US Navy, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the Royal Australian Navy and all its operations in the South China Sea and elsewhere has probably got quite a few of these, I would suggest, and has exploited them without publicising it. That's just what military organisations do. But I think beyond the technological and tactical elements of this is a political dimension that reinforces the narrative that the Chinese don't care about EEZs, territorial seas, and other multinational legal determinations about which country has sovereignty over its waters. So I think the fact that the Philippines publicised this quickly was smart. I think they've been very good at bringing transparency to what the Chinese are doing more broadly, as you've highlighted, Ray, in your most recent article, but in other fora as well, about using these massive Coast Guard ships. I mean, the Chinese seem to think by using Coast Guard ships instead of Navy ships to bully the Filipinos, that's somehow different. It's like, no, it's still the Chinese doing that. You might think us Westerners are silly. We're really not, and we get it. And most of us have more mature polities than the CCP's version of China, which is still only about 70 years old. So, I think what the Filipinos have done is very clever. They've, bought the BrahMos anti-ship missile. They've invited the US Army in for exercises, which have become standing deployments for long-range maritime strike missiles. So, they're a resource-poor military that I think is leveraging its alliances and defence relationships cleverly to provide some kind of minimal deterrent, or at least change the strategic calculus of the Chinese.
But, getting back to the question of drones, is there a place for the Philippines as a resource, needy country to leverage drones on their side of this gray zone war? Is there a way for them to sort of take advantage of the fact that these are inexpensive, and maybe there's a place for them, like Ukraine, to leverage something like this in a conflict with a larger power?
Yeah, I think so. And as the guest on your show, I really should answer your question.
We'll put you anyway.
Yeah. I think there have been some really interesting developments by the Ukrainian Navy and their military intelligence folks in the development of these long-range maritime strike systems that, the Sea Baby and others that provide a cheap approach to denying waterways that we haven't used previously. The Philippines can build small boats just as lots of small companies up the East Australian coast could do the same. And if you imagine if they had a few hundred of these, they just need to have them. And that changes the calculus for the Chinese. And you're already starting to see Chinese companies are copying some of these Ukrainian uncrewed surface vessels and selling them openly. I think countries like the Philippines, like Japan, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, Papua New Guinea, that have littoral waters that may come into contest, these are the kind of systems that will be important. I'm not terribly interested about the big naval battles in the Central Pacific that are thousands of miles from everyone. I mean, that's largely irrelevant in many respects. That's just a highway to go back and forth. But it will be within 1,000 kilometres of the green bits that really matter in any future war. And I think that these kind of systems have a real role on the surface, under the surface, and in the air.
So an ethical dilemma in the U.S. and other Western countries is, should a human still be in the kill chain of command? Where do you come down on that?
Conceptually, absolutely. And whether that means pushing the button to kill another human or pushing a button with preset boundaries for where humans can be killed, for example, like a Sea Whiz or a Patriot missile, I think we should. That's certainly US military direction at the moment. That's policy. Now, whether that will change remains to be seen. The Chinese don't have that policy. In fact, they see taking humans out of the loop as a strength because in their kind of society, giving humans agency, it sets a bad example. If they can make decisions about military stuff, they might make decisions about political stuff, and that just can't be tolerated. So it's something I'm encouraged by the debate that's gone on over the last decade. But, at some point, it might come down to a lesser of two evils, as all war decisions do. We might have to allow a higher level of autonomous killing if we don't want to lose, because losing is even worse. So, whilst conceptually humans should be in the loop, we need to remain open to the possibility that we might have to make some tough decisions about this in the future if we actually want to retain the kind of world and the kind of democratic lifestyles that we currently enjoy.
One thing that has got a lot of attention, of course, recently, especially in the recent U.S. presidential election and just discussions that's happened around shipbuilding and those kinds of things, is that, in a lot of cases, Western democracies, and the U.S. in particular, aren't really building things anymore. And that's certainly true in the world of drones, where so many of the components are, have these, supply chains that go through China. And China actually has a lot of influence as to who can get them, who is, they recently, restricted some of the exports. And then other countries are getting into the space. In Ukraine, we've seen the use of, say, Turkish made drones and others. What is happening to drone manufacturing? And if we are, of course, it's also a dual use technology. So the same technology that's used to have the drone to sort of, take a picture at your wedding, it can be the same technology that's going to drop a grenade on a trench. So what kinds of things do countries need to be thinking through? One, on who they buy this technology from, and two, do they need to maybe be looking into building their own drone industries?
Yeah, I mean, supply chains, driven by some of the supply disasters of COVID, I think has been really front of mind for many military institutions over the last 4 years, and it needs to be. But I think at the end of the day, what we're going to see with many elements of military materiel will be a three-tier system. There'll be some things that countries will decide they must be able to design, produce, maintain, and adapt themselves. And each country, that will be slightly different. For a country like America, that will be a larger number of things. For a country like Australia, it will be a smaller number of things. There will also then be a second tier where you will only source stuff from a trusted group of allies and partners. And then the third group will be just anything. We don't really care where we get it from. I think the second and first ones are the things we need to focus on. What must we absolutely design, build, and support ourselves indigenously? And I think drones comfortably fit into that for many countries because it's a very low bar. It's very simple componentry. There's small engines, there's sensors, the control systems, the software, the training of people. Very, very simple. And probably 50 countries are able to do that. The Ukrainians in particular have decided they want to have an indigenous industry for both short, medium, and long-term, cheap and exquisite drones. They've developed that and continue to develop it with lots of investment from other countries, including the recently announced $1.5 billion from the Biden administration, which is actually a very clever investment because they can build them far cheaper than what we can. So I think we do need to have indigenous industries with a lot of these things. On top of that, we've seen the Chinese in the last year constrain the export of drones and components to certain countries, including Ukraine. I note they haven't constrained supply of them to North Korea, Russia, or Iran. So you're seeing constraints from China, which is the most prodigious maker of drones and componentry in the world, and the COVID-driven, now military-driven demand for indigenous manufacturer or partner manufacturer among partner manufacturer. And I think drones are just one of those things that are going to have to fit in that top tier of either indigenous or very trusted partners.
All right, I'm going to go off topic just for a second because I'm so curious. There's been more and more in the Australian press, including the think tank world, that basically argues there's no way Australia will ever get a Virginia-class sub. And planning has to be done now for what Australia's going to do instead. Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, I think, Jim, just for our audience, we should set this up a little bit. This is a reference to the AUKUS Pillar 1 agreement under which eventually China, Australia would receive Virginia-class submarines and eventually produce with the United States and Great Britain something called the AUKUS class.
Yeah, no, thanks for that context, Ray. I think it's important to understand. I think the debate that's going on now is the debate that should have preceded the decision in the first place. There was no debate. There was no assessment of options. I mean, I was in defence and my boss was the person who ended up leading it. And this was a very closely held, small group conversation that was focused really on one thing: how does Australia get nuclear submarines? So the deep analysis about opportunity costs of that, how might we spend that $360 billion to achieve a more robust, adaptable strategic deterrent, wasn't had before the agreement. So that's the debate that's going on now. I think it's very, very healthy that democracies are able to have those kind of debates. We should have those debates. And, this is the biggest single procurement in the history of Australia. Like, nothing else beats this. Nothing else we bought across any endeavour beats this. And the lack of debate beforehand, I think, was unhealthy. So we're seeing a more healthy debate now. I think that's good. There's lots of different views out there. Will Australia ever get a Virginia-class submarine? If I was a betting person, I wouldn't put money on it because even with the $4 billion Australia's given the US military to fix up its shipyards, there's absolutely no evidence that they're going to be able to do that within the next decade. There's also no evidence that the Australian Navy can drastically expand the number of submariners. I mean, this is an exponential increase in the number of submariners required. So I think there's a whole lot of high-risk elements of this program that weren't sufficiently considered in the original decision that are now being exposed to the spotlight, which is what democracies do and should do. And so now there is a healthy debate. I think the problem with the debate is, one, sometimes it gets confused with the debate over the US-Australia alliance. That is not a debate. It is a bipartisan issue. It is something that the majority of Australians have supported ever since it came about at the end of 1941 and shouldn't be confused that way, because you can be a very strong supporter of the US relationship and alliance and cultural relationship, societal relationship, economic relationship, and still question whether AUKUS Pillar 1 is a smart thing to do. So we need to be careful. Debate over AUKUS should not be seen as a stalking horse for a debate over the Australia-US relationship, although it is sometimes, and people like to quote all kinds of silly things, and whether it's Trump and these kind of things. I think the relationship's more important and more enduring than individual politicians.
Okay, but let's in the worst case scenario, let's say somehow, as you implied, these Virginia class subs don't materialize, and there is this capability gap, and the agreement as written, as devised, doesn't come to pass. That seems like a pretty serious turn of events. And what are the impacts on the alliance and on Australian defense if they've canceled this contract for the French built sub? A French design sub, and now there's no replacement, or at least nothing until sometime in the distant future.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't see it as catastrophic. Australia and the US have had ups and downs in that relationship before, and it would be a conversation and a negotiation. it would be nowhere near as bad as the Australia-French thing. And, that was poorly played by Australia, to be quite frank. It would be something like the Americans would probably come to Australia and say, listen, fellas, we don't think either you're going to pull it off, we're not going to be able to pull it off. How about instead we offer you, a squadron of B-21 bombers with, 1,000 long-range missiles, and you look at a fleet of, say, 6 to 8 Tsuruyu follow-on submarines, which, Japanese think are pretty good for the Western Pacific and have a much lower manning bill and are produced at a rate of 1 to 2 a year. So, I wouldn't see it as catastrophic. There's probably more opportunity than downside in the relationship. And if that were to happen in the next 5 years, we'd roll with it because, one, we'd have to, but two, there may well be a lot of upsides into that kind of decision as well.
What I hear you saying is that a discussion really has to be had, but it's not being had right now.
Yeah, it should be had. I mean, I thought, in my 35 years in the military, I thought I was serving a democracy. So, and I'm pretty sure I still was. But, democracy in action is messy, untidy. And some of the statements I've seen comparing criticism of AUKUS to criticism of Sydney Opera House and these kind of things, it's like, come on, we're here to preserve the democracy. And I think it's really important that all voices are heard in this kind of important debate.
Well, so there are forces at work at sort of, we've recently been having a discussion, and we're going to lead you down a little bit of a different path because we've been having a discussion, as we said, with your co-guest in that previous podcast, Mike Studeman, and he used the word recently in reference to China's influence in the United States as a silent invasion. You may recognize that term from a book that was produced in Australia in 2018, authored by Clive Hamilton, of the same name. What lessons did Australia learn from its sort of dalliance with, sort of wrestling with this question of, was there something of a, quote, silent invasion of Australia going on, and, then passing that counter-interference legislation and, taking measures to sort of counter what it perceived were the influences in Australia, and what lessons should the U.S. take as we're looking ahead now at some of the things that Mike's talking about?
Yeah, I think for your listeners, if they haven't read Clive's book, they should. It is a superb book. I mean, Clive's CV, to write this, he's not some neocon China basher. In fact, he's exactly the opposite. So, this is an evidence-based exploration of a whole range of Chinese coercion and influence activities in Australia in the 2010s and earlier. It kind of culminated with the Sam Dastyari, an Australian politician who took received cash to say things that favoured China, let's say that. This resulted in a whole lot of legislation that I think has been very good for our country. It set an example to other countries that you can stand up to China without suffering too much. And that's what the Chinese hate the most. Not so much that we took action against them, that we set an example for other countries. They hate that the most. And I would hope our country continues to do it. I think we've eased off a little bit under this current government. There's been a little bit too much love there, but I think we're starting to see again the Chinese don't love anyone. They're happy to coerce and influence everybody. So I think there are a lot of lessons in that book about Chinese influence operations for any country that cares to take them, whether it's Canada, the United States, or Europe. And that should be a text in war colleges in many countries around the world, in my view.
Right. Since we're doing this tour of the horizon of military and Chinese influence, is the Australian military currently in a position to be a deterrent to China, even with the U.S. as an ally?
I think, there's a minimalist deterrent just by having a force in being. Now, you can argue how capable it is and how far it can strike, but just having a military changes the calculus for an enemy compared to not having one. I think parts of... I spoke about this at another event this morning. There's no real concept of middle power deterrence for middle powers that don't have nuclear weapons. But I think, Australia's capacity to deter China involves things like our regional partnerships. Although I think we're overly focused on the Southwest Pacific sometimes, but those partnerships are part of our deterrent and part of our indicators and warnings network. Certainly, the alliance with the United States is a very powerful part of our deterrence. The extended nuclear umbrella, whether that's a real thing or not, I don't know, but as long as the Chinese think it is, that matters. Our partnership with countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, and Japan is part of that network deterrence framework, I think. And then just our ability to continue to deploy up into the South China Sea with ships and maritime patrol aircraft, I think, are important parts of that. I think, too, having a warfighting posture is an important part of your deterrence. It's like, we don't want to fight, but if you want to fight, no worries, bring it on. I think good militaries do that. They message that they don't want to fight, but if you bring it on, absolutely, we love it. And certainly you see that at the moment. The Australian Army, the reformation that's gone on under the current chief is amazing to see. I mean, there's a lot of it that's not public, but it's an institution that is entirely focused on expeditionary warfighting operations as part of our strategic deterrence. And I think countries in the region must have that kind of messaging to China. We don't want to fight you, but if you want to fight, no problem at all. And that, I think, would be a significant deterrent to Xi and his PLA mates.
Well, on that note, as the buells fade into the distance, Mick Ryan, we want to thank you for joining us, and we want to know where. So I understand you still, of course, are putting out your Substack. And
yep,
so where should people be keeping track of your work?
Lowy Institute. I'm the Senior Fellow for Military Studies at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. It's a wonderful organisation. I recommend you follow them. I put out articles at least once a month there and do events with them. CSIS, where I'm a non-resident fellow, and then my Substack, Futura Doctrina, do articles and weekly commentaries that you can listen to as well. And obviously Blue Skies, LinkedIn and Twitter/X. I have presence on all them as well.
All right. Well, Mick Ryan, thanks again for coming back. Thanks for educating us and our audience on the future of drone warfare. And we hope that you'll keep coming back as you are a fantastic guest. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak to you and Jim and to see your smiling faces. And I'm always happy to have a conversation in the future.
Well, Ray, drones, warfare, you military guys have all the fun.
Well, I don't know how much fun this is going to be going forward. I think that we are certainly in a very everything is moving very quickly, right? And so I think, as Mick indicates, countries aren't exactly sure how fast they need to move with this. In some ways, Ukraine's battlefield is very new and transformational, but in other ways is World War I, right? In trench warfare. So, what are the values of these different elements? How fast do you need to chase after each iteration of a new thing? Now, I'm very interested in the question of what do smaller countries do, because as countries are looking at how do we deter and defeat a large aggressive nation, which we have in the world now, several of these, and especially in the Indo-Pacific. What are their options? You can't just go out and buy a squadron of F-35s or 10 and suddenly be able to sort of counter all that China could throw at you, for example. Do drones offer a cheap alternative in order to kind of just be able to hold your head above water?
Well, look, I know Ukraine is not a perfect example everywhere, but the fact that maritime drones cleared the Black Sea of the Russian Navy, that is pretty damn impressive.
That is absolutely.
This is a new chapter in how these things are going to be fought. And my question is technology, the most advanced technology, going to win, or is quantity going to win?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of been a combination of both in Ukraine, right? I mean, it's been a very advanced technology, and yet at the same time used very cheaply and in large quantities. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is going to be a continuing debate, and I want to go back to diplomacy one of these days. So, speaking of diplomacy, do you have a good story to tell us that will highlight your diplomatic skills?
No, because I don't have any of those.
Of course not.
We were talking about war. I was going to give you a war story. I'm the military guy.
Oh yeah, I forget.
Yeah, I know you forgot. I got this nice haircut for you. So I was thinking about when warfare changes, right? And I was in Iraq in 2004, which was sort of right after the initial phase of the war, and we were sort of getting used to the fact that we were going to be here for a while, and the circumstances were a little different than what we had planned for, right? We ended up, now we had these rebellions that were happening, and I was in the south where the Shiite rebellions were happening, and strangely enough, for whatever reason, at the base that I was at, I was a communications squadron commander. At the base that I was at, they had not started shelling the base. There had been shellings at many other bases, but for some reason we were immune up until that point. And so the first shells to hit this Talil Air Base, it was called, happened. I remember it very distinctly. I was in bed and I could feel the percussion because they've hit close enough to where I was so that I could feel it. I was like, well, that was interesting. And so I get up and I grab my land mobile radio and I turn it on, and I can hear the base commander saying, "Was that the Italians?" And the reason he said that was because we had these explosive ordnance disposal teams that were running around collecting up old ordnance that was all left over from previous wars, including the first Gulf War the U.S. fought in, and they would put them in huge piles and blow them up, right? And the Italians were always doing this without any warning. So the Italian EOD troops would neglect to tell the command post that we're going to set something off. And so, we were sort of used to the idea that something would just blow up all of a sudden. It didn't worry about it. Well, eventually he decided that probably wasn't the Italians at 5 o'clock in the morning and whatever had happened. So he sent us into what we called Condition Red. And Condition Red was an old Cold War construct that we were still applying to this war, which was completely out of place, because Condition Red is what you said when the Soviet bombers were overhead, right? And that means the bombs were falling. That means you should take cover, right? So he declares Condition Red because that was what we had to go on at the time. We hadn't adapted. And so now we're all sort of, in our places, but people who are in tents don't necessarily stay where they are. They run into hardened shelters. So all of a sudden, all these people come running into the squadron headquarters, and then we're trying to put everybody in a particular place. And then eventually he says, okay, obviously whatever attack this was is over. It was over after like 2 rockets. And so he put us in Condition Black. And what you're supposed to do in Condition Black is you're supposed to look for all of the unexploded ordnance that may be lying around, like the cluster bomblet that rolls under the latrine. And you want to go out and find those things, right? So we send out these teams that we've all trained for this. So through years and years of exercises. And so they go out and they're looking for unexploded ordnance. So it takes forever for these teams to look. And so I would tell them, I'd say, look, this is not a search. If a rocket hit our tent city, everybody's going to know where it is, whether it blew up or not, right? So you don't have to go searching for something. This is a sweep. You just go and does anything look weird, right? I remember coming back to my headquarters at one point, and I've got my NCO, my non-commissioned officer, is standing there, and I said, "Hey, is everybody back? Because we need to call in the results." And he said, "Well, there's everybody came back, but I sent one more team up to the roof to check." And I looked at him. I said, "You don't think if a rocket hit the roof, we might not know about that?" And you saw it had dawned on him. But the thing was, we had just trained for so long for this other way that the war was supposed to be fought. And in the training, you would have the inspectors would be out putting these big bombs out, and so that you could go out and say, okay, I found the bomb, and we're going to tape it off, and we're going to get far away before we key the radio, and all these things that you did as part of this old way of war that simply just didn't apply to what was happening. And it just reminded me as we're talking to Mick, we can be really slow to adapt, and oftentimes we just don't get there until the first bombs hit.
Until the bomb's on the roof.
Or not, yes.
All right.
All right. Jim, thanks for joining me. It's and again, thanks as always to Ian Ellis Jones, our magnificent producer. Follow him at Ian Ellis Jones on X. If you liked this episode, make sure you go out and check the other one with Mick and Mike Studeman. Episode 7, Why Should We Care About the Defense of Taiwan? Once again, our most popular audio podcast yet. We're on X at Indo-Pac Podcast. You can get us on Apple and Spotify. You can follow us on LinkedIn, or you can email us, Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com. And finally, don't forget to go and see our wonderful sponsor, Bauer Group Asia, at BauerGroupAsia.com. For Jim, for Ian, I'm Ray. Join us next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?